Ukraine's latest attacks have set Russian oil refineries ablaze and choked fuel supplies for across the vast country. The lines are growing at Russian gas stations, and so is the frustration and the uncertainty. But the question remains, will this pressure push Putin to end the war? The Russian leader has made a rare admission, acknowledging that problems persist. But Putin insisted that the shortages in fuel are not critical and they are temporary.
These attacks on our facilities certainly create problems, that is obvious. We are currently seeing a certain shortage, though I would say it is not critical.
Putin's claims have not reassured everyone as the fuel crisis bring the war home to ordinary Russians.
I think the situation is not very good. They say one thing on television, and in reality it's another. There's plenty of people waiting in lines. Whether there's gas, I don't know. People are queuing everywhere.
Estimates count over 50 reported attacks by Ukraine on oil refineries, depots, terminals and other oil infrastructure in Russia and Crimea since late March. The amount of crude oil Russia processed into fuel in June was down 25% from a year ago, the lowest level in over 2 decades. Meanwhile, Ukraine is publicly taunting Moscow over a series of strikes targeting Russia's oil industry. On Tuesday, Ukrainian Defense Ministry shared a graphic detailing the attacks on Russia's oil infrastructure throughout the month of June. According to the graphic, Ukraine struck Russian oil facilities on 17 of the month's 30 days. And there is a caption which says, June's done, July's calendar is already loading. Now, the strikes are not limited to oil facilities. Last week, Ukraine's domestically produced Flamingo missiles struck a key military facility more than 300 miles behind the front lines. The long-range missiles, which entered service only last autumn, targeted the Titan Barricade Research and Production Center in the city of Volgograd. Ukrainian President Zelensky confirmed the strike, which sparked a fire, saying that the facility was a legitimate target for Ukraine's long-range strikes. Russia is maintaining its assault on Ukrainian cities. It launched a glide bomb attack on Zaporizhia, killing at least 2 people and injuring 15 others. The video shows the first responders rushing to rescue and assist. Regional Governor Ivan Fedorov said in a post on Telegram that Russian forces dropped 7 glide bombs on the city in over a 90-minute period. All right, to discuss this further, I'm now being joined on the broadcast by Ben Aris, founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews, joining us from Berlin. And we are also joined by Scott Lucas, West Asia analyst, joining us from Wicklow in Ireland. To both my guests, thank you so much for making time for us. Let me start with Scott Lucas. Do you think this is the pressure that will get Putin to back off from Ukraine? Over to you.
Well, we wait and see. Because the fundamental here is, and I'm sure Ben will agree, is that this is Vladimir Putin's legacy project. This idea of bringing Ukraine into greater Russia is what he has actually staked, not just his immediate political future on, but what he will give to Russia. And he, as he restated last weekend in a series of interviews and appearances before his party meeting, he's still dedicated to seizing more Ukrainian territory, specifically the rest of the Donetsk region in the east of the country. So at this point, he's not appearing to be willing to accept a ceasefire based on the current front lines. That said, this pressure on Russia is extremely serious. Only 2 of Russia's major oil refineries have not been hit by Ukraine this year. Most of them have been hit by multiple times. The Moscow oil refinery, responsible for 40% of gasoline and I think up to 50% of diesel in and near Moscow, is offline for 6 months. You have gasoline rationing in more than 50 Russian regions. Russian-occupied Crimea is in danger of being isolated. It has completely banned fuel sales to anyone except the military and essential services. And we have firsthand testimony, courtesy of the independent outlet Medusa, from Russians in terms of what they're feeling, that some of them just cannot actually move now. They are actually stuck in place during the day. and life in some areas of Russia is being crippled, if not pushed to a halt. Does that mean that that will mean Russia has lost? Absolutely not. Does it mean that Putin will quit? Probably not. But it does mean there are serious constraints on a Russian invasion of Ukraine that was already stalling out.
Understood. Now, as we're well into the 5th year of the war, there's been a rare admittance from the Russian president that there is a fuel shortage. There is an issue. We've not heard such acceptance in the past, at least not in these last 4+ years. Ben, let me come to you with that. Do you feel this is the pressure which is going to make Russia rethink their strategy towards Ukraine, which was largely seen as a walkover in the beginning, but here we are into year 5? And do you think greater Russia is Putin's legacy project, as Scott suggested?
Well, the short answer to the first question is no. This is a serious disruption. There are shortages everywhere. I talk to people in Moscow every day, and they're all complaining that it's become very hard to get gas. And Russia is an enormous country. Moscow is the biggest city in Europe. You need a car to get around. However, to put it into context, like the Kremlin's officials were saying, that while there is severe disruptions, nevertheless, this is not a full-blown crisis in the sense that it's going to bring the economy to a standstill. That's not happening. And they're in the process of finding workarounds. That Putin is importing now gasoline from Belarus, which has 2 large refineries and is making up some of the shortfall. The exports of crude to India are now at a record high, and what happens there is they're refined in Indian refineries and sent back. That the production of oil products as opposed to crude is down by about 13–14%. But then that's not going to hurt the budget either, because all the Kremlin's doing is, instead of exporting the higher value petrol, they're just exporting the crude that they can't process. And so the money to the budget is more or less the same, something like $160 billion last year. So this is severely crippling. It's severely embarrassing, but it's not the sort of killer pressure that's going to force the Kremlin to do anything. And we're just now into what's becoming a brutal slugfest between the two. And what's changed and why this fuel crisis is happening is that the Ukrainians have upped their game. So in the first 2 years, they put drone production into place. They can make 7 million drones a year now from nothing in 2022. But they're now introducing these medium-range drones. They're bigger, more powerful. And you mentioned the flamingos, and that's a big change, because the one thing, the disparity between the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, is that Russia has missiles. It's making 2,500 a month, and those things can flatten whatever their target is. Specifically, they've been targeting the power infrastructure. And the trouble with drones is they don't carry a big enough payload to flatten a refinery. But the volume of them and the increasing size of them, and now the introduction of the cruise missiles, the Flamingo, that is doing a lot more damage, which is making this crisis worse. And the Ukrainians have now adopted the policy of, like, our drones don't do that much damage, but if we send 50 of them, then collectively they will do damage, is what we're seeing now.
I hear your point. Now, the fact that you mentioned that it's turned into a slugfest, and here you have this behemoth Russia, military power, and then you have Ukraine. And as I just repeat what I said earlier, that it was not considered as a war which would go on, at least not this long. Scott, I'll come to you with that. Look at what Ukraine is saying, that was June, wait for July. Where is this confidence coming from when we understand that the US is largely occupied with Iran since a number of months, and Ukraine has been wanting Patriot missile systems and other assistance? But what are they dealing with right now on the basis of which they're carrying out these kind of attacks?
Because the confidence from Ukraine, and indeed from those who support Ukraine's defense against Russia, especially European countries, is no, it's not directly through NATO. NATO provides support, but I'm talking more about individual European countries which have continued to give backing, political, financial, military, despite the Trump administration effectively leaving the building. The confidence is this is being done without the U.S. As you note, the Patriots are a different dimension. It's in terms of how you defend Ukraine against Russia's, missile and drone strikes, mainly targeting civilian sites as well as energy infrastructure. And Ukraine is withstanding that. They're taking heavy damage, and they need to get anti-ballistic missile systems, but they're looking elsewhere for that. Indeed, they were in conversations both with Sweden and Denmark in the past couple of days about this. But let's flip this around on the other side. It was only last October that the Trump administration told Ukraine, well, you can't have Tomahawk missiles. These are the long-range missiles. And everybody thought, oh, this is a huge setback for Zelensky. Fact of the matter now is that everybody knows that the Ukraine will not get the Tomahawks. But as Ben noted, they're developing their own domestic capability. They are getting an increasing European effort in the longer run to develop missile support. And I generally agree with Ben. The fact here is that analysts like to say, is it over? Who's winning? Who's losing? That's not where we are. The question here is just simply, will Ukraine, as it were, hold the line against Russia, both on the ground and in the air? And I think the answer right now to that is yes. But what we're seeing significantly for the first time is they may actually reverse this. And I'd be interested in Ben's opinion as to whether Crimea is now vulnerable, because that Ukrainian effort is not through a ground invasion, but through destroying bridges, as well as destroying refineries and other facilities to cut off that peninsula to the point where it cannot continue to survive on a day-to-day basis under Russian occupation.
That's interesting, Scott. Ben, let me come to you with that. Do you feel Ukraine can hold the line with Russia, and let alone pushing it back?
Yeah, this is the innovation. This is the surprise of the whole Ukraine war, this asymmetrical war. And we saw the same thing with the US take on Iran, is that smaller powers, weaker powers, with the use of drones specifically, which has been a game changer, can hold their own against larger, better armed powers. But what that means, it doesn't give you victory. It just means you stop the advances. So in Iran too, the Americans were attempting to pound Tehran into defeat, into capitulation. Hasn't happened. Same in a situation in Ukraine. And so something like Crimea is a good example that, as I said, it's a slugfest. So the damage being done is going up and becoming more and more significant. So you can destroy the infrastructure. Crimea has no gas at all anymore. It's run out and it can't get more. The Kerch Bridge that connects the Crimea to the mainland is also vulnerable, and that's been attacked several times, and one assumes eventually it'll be blown up. But then you get into, I don't know, one of these like Battle of Britain scenarios where you have to like send fuel by tankers. The whole like siege of the UK during the Second World War by the Germans. It didn't collapse. And I don't think you're going to, quote unquote, lose Crimea, but it is going to become completely dysfunctional. And that's what I mean by slugfest, is that the difference, the disparity between what Ukraine has in terms of cruise missiles and what Russia has is enormous. But what Zelensky's done is he's basically given up on Western support. The Americans are out. They said no Tomahawks. The Germans have said no Towers missiles, or equally big, powerful, that would be able to blow up the Kerch Bridge. And they've been specifically held back by the West. So the Ukrainians are like, well, we'll just make our own. And it's stunning. I mean, they've created a highly efficient defense sector from nothing in 4 years. And earlier this year, Zelensky said, we now supply 60% of our own military weapons and ammo needs, which is mind-boggling. And then now the Europeans are getting involved, but the useful thing they're doing there is not sending new rockets, Shadowstorm, whatever. They're building factories and sharing technology and increasing the sophistication of the weapons being produced by Ukraine, as well as the volume. And Russia's got to sit there, and so it's being pounded. But in the meantime, the key there, my colleague said, is Ukraine's run out of Patriot interceptor missiles. Its skies are open, and so it's getting pounded as well. Hence the slugfest. This is just hugely destructive, and it's going to become more destructive as both sides ramp up their production.
Scott, let me just quickly get one last reaction from you before we wind up. The fact that it has been brought to a slugfest when no one imagined that it would last this long, does that in itself comprise a certain victory for Ukraine, that they held it?
Ukraine has survived. I mean, the fundamental here is that the original Russian intention was to overrun Kyiv in 10 days and to capture or kill President Zelensky and the leadership. In the 5th year, there's no prospect of Russia making a significant advance beyond possibly taking, 1 or 2 towns in the Donetsk region without taking all of that fortress belt, as it were. So Russia's hopes, as it were, are probably limited to holding about 20% of Ukraine at most, but then they have to hold it against an 80% of Ukraine, which, even though it's taken damage, the idea here is that with support, again, especially from the Europeans, but others in the international community, it economically then rebuilds. It moves to a position of strength, especially if you can get a ceasefire. And what we get, albeit in the 21st century, in a very rough analogy, is the West Germany versus East Germany scenario in the Cold War. That East Germany was in the Soviet bloc of influence, but it wound up struggling in terms of the economic fronts and then the political fronts, whereas the rest of West Germany drew closer to the United States, the rest of Europe, the international community, and became one of the leading economic powerhouses in the 20th century. I'm not saying that's going to be an immediate, Ukrainian powerhouse, but I think in a few years, with Ukraine in the European Union, which I expect, it not only survived, it now has a position of strength, even as we have that uncertainty over those areas that Russia continues to occupy.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me here. Ukraine survived. That's something we can both and we can all agree on. The war still continues. It's well into its 5th year. We'll need to wait and watch. Scott Lucas, Ben Harris, thank you so much for joining me here.
Thank you.